So I'm doing a session which is Getting the Best Out of MVC. That's the title. It could also be called What I've Put Together About MVC that hasn't partially been covered in this conference by myself or other people in less than 2 hours. Okay? So how many of you were at my session yesterday? Okay. So I've tried really hard not to have an overlap with what I showed yesterday. Okay? So if you see a reference to certain things, because a lot of things that when I talk about MVC, I always concentrate on trying to encourage best practices or what I found that works well. So it's kind of hard for me to talk about MVC without talking about best practices, and I don't really do a kind of best practices on MVC because it's normally I apply it all the time. So there are references to things that I will say that I said yesterday, but I've tried to kind of make it a tiny little bit different so that we don't get a lot of overlap. Also, it is the last session of the conference, so I guess you guys are really tired and you really, really, really want to go home back to your wives and children that are screaming and saying, "Did you buy me anything?" So we'll make it very nice and calm. Okay? Have you had a good conference? Is it me or you guys just don't show any kind of emotions? Second. Oh, okay, right. So this is your happy, right? This is, we're really ecstatic here, right? Okay, good. So, I was talking to Scott today, and he said to me, oh, don't worry about it. I've got, why don't you do this demo and that demo, and you know, you can put that in because if you don't have contents. I said, well, I've got more or less, but yeah, that'll be a good thing. I'll put this in, I'll put that in. And then he said, so give a shout out to me, which I did. And he said to me, you know, do these demos. I then found out that he's already done those demos. So I had to take those demos out. Okay, so I've tried not to repeat that, but I will still give him the shout out. Okay, so what are we going to start with? Razor. Razor is the new view engine that is in ASP.NET MVC 3. And how many of you have actually played with Razor? Okay, not a lot. So Razor is how I would say it, like if you are starting a new ASP.NET MVC application today, you shouldn't really ever use ASPX forms anymore. Only if you have legacy code and you want to transfer things, you know, gradually from one form to another, one view engine to another, you shouldn't really be using ASPX because Razor is so much nicer view engine. It's less noise, so there isn't so much curly percentages and the greater than and lower than. It's more intermixed, so it allows you to intermix better HTML and code. Although saying that, it sounds like a bad thing. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It has a support for sections, which we'll see, and there's a concept of view star, which allows for reuse, and it has concepts around master pages, not exactly the same, but similar. And one of the important things is that by default, everything is HTML encoded. So anytime you write something, it's already HTML encoded. If you've used the ASPX format before Razor came out, you'll know that before in ASPX we used to write, can you guys actually see this? Used to write something like that, right? And we used to write HTML, whatever. Now, in ASP.NET MVC 3, using Visual Studio 2010 with .NET 4.0, big mouthful, instead of using the equal sign, it's the quote, it's the colon, which means that by default, everything is HTML encoded. Well, with Razor, it's always HTML encoded. So if you want to actually not HTML encode, then you would do HTML raw. And that allows you to do non-encoded HTML, which is a good thing, right? It's about less typing all the time. Okay, so that, by default, everything is HTML encoded. And let's just show you some stuff here. Now, I've got a new app going at some point in time, right? I've got it all ready. And see, I have the Razor View Engine here. I'll use HTML5 semantic markup. This would allow for some things which we'll see a little bit later on, which is about unobtrusive JavaScript. It will provide support for that. And the first thing that you notice here is that title of the application is MVC application 14, right? Because the previous one was 13, and it went horribly wrong. So I went until 14 so that everything goes more or less smoothly, hopefully, okay? Right, so this is what Razor looks like. I'll go to the index page. This is Razor, okay? That's it. Simple as that, right? So now I have this symbol over here, which is a view bag. Forget what view bag is. We'll see what is good about view bag, what is bad about view bag when we talk about view models, etc. And what that is just getting data from the model, right? So that's the equivalent to the view data dash, view data square brackets, colon, message, square brackets, finish. That's the equivalent. Now it's a dynamic type in MVC3, right? And one of the cool things about this is that I can just come here and I can say, for example, my name is, and write view bag, for example, name, and my email is viewbag email, right? And I can write mail@somewhere.com. Okay? Now, you see that I'm using the ampersand in the email address. I'm using the ampersand in the code that I'm referencing. Now, Razor is smart enough to obviously know the differences between that. So if I go to my home controller, and I come to this guy and I enter some values here, name equals Joe Smith, and email equals joe@smith.com, for instance. And if this doesn't go terribly bad, it will launch, and you will see that from one side we have the code, and from the other side we have the sample email address here. Okay? So you can see that you have that nicely over there. I think you guys can see this, but in case you cannot, I will zoom that over here. See? So it interprets what is meant to be code and what is not. That allows for greater intermix, of course. So that's got an advantage and a disadvantage. And here's like the stamp of the best practices. The disadvantage is that, I don't know if you're familiar with a view engine called Spark View Engine. How many of you use that? Give a big shout. Right, okay. Raising your hands works as well. I said shout, but raise your hands. Right, the view engine, Spark, what that allows you to do, it adds attributes to HTML elements. The advantage of that is that it kind of restricts what you can do in code, in terms of code, inside your views, right? Now, the first 4 years ago when ASP.NET MVC came out, everyone said, oh dear, we're going back to spaghetti code. Yeah, we're going back to the mixing this with that and this, and mixing data inside our views, and mixing, you know, the kind of partially business logic with our views and that. No, we're not going back to spaghetti code. For spaghetti code, we have web matrix. That wasn't it. So the disadvantage of having code and having this easily intermix between code and view data, like HTML elements, etc., inside your view engines, inside your views, is that you might be susceptible to kind of putting a lot of code in there, which you really should not. Views should be restricted to only code that has to do with view logic. That is, things that need to be used to display information. So view logic can also fall into an if condition. Yes, if I have an if condition that if something display this, if not display that, that is okay for view logic. Maybe you want to do it in a different way. Maybe you can use extension methods. You can use HTML helpers, for instance, to encapsulate that view logic inside a method, which then you could run against a unit test. But simple logic, it should always be simple code inside your views. So although Razor gives us this flexibility of easily combining views, you know, HTML elements with code, don't fall into the trap of putting a lot of code into your views. Keep it to the bare minimum, okay? So another thing that Razor allows you to do is work with the kind of concept of master pages and content pages. If you look over here, see that in our application, now what we don't have such a site master. We have this thing called a layout, an underscore layout, okay? And this underscore layout would be the kind of equivalent to what we had before in terms of a master page. This allows us to define the overall content. That's the thing you see with the blue background, etc. And then inside that, you see, if you remember from ASPX, we had the action links. And then we have inside there a reference to a Razor command, which is render body. And what that will do is then take the contents of each individual page and render it inside that layout. Okay? So when I run this, what you see is the actual layout. This is all part of that layout, and then this guy is the actual content for the index and for the about page. You see that I have the one for the about page, right? Now, if you go to the index page, you see that there is no reference to this layout. How does it know that it's meant to use that layout? So one other concept introduced is the view start. And what this allows us to do is define common sections of code that are going to be used throughout our different views that we're creating. So we don't have to redefine this over and over and over again inside each of our view pages. We just define it there. And it's not limited to this. If I have more code in common that wants to be used across my entire application, I could also define it in the layout page. All right? So that's why when you add a new view, if I go, for example, to Home Controller here, and I say add a new view, you can see that it says use a layout or master page, leave empty if you want the view start file. Because what it's going to do is use that view start file to then inject in your actual layout page. That's a technique that's being used to kind of make it easier for you to not have to define things over and over again. Again, going back to the concept of the less code, better. Now, one of the things you would normally do in Razor is have custom kind of headers and footers. For instance, I can have a footer down here where I want to inject some JavaScript code. I want to have my JavaScript code at the bottom of the page, right? Or I want to have my JavaScript code at the top of the page. So what I can do is define a section. So I can do render section over here and give it a name. For example, we'll call it footer. And then there's a second property which tells us whether that section is required. That means that every child page that uses that layout has to define the section, right? How do you do that? So I can go to the index page, and then here, say section, and then define the footer, right? And in there I can do whatever. I can reference some script files, I can put some paragraphs, whatever I want, anything I want, I can do in there. And what that allows me to do is go a little bit, it's kind of like multiple placeholders that we can have, okay? And you can have those either, as I said, having to need each page define its own, or if you pass in a false, it means that it's not required. Okay? So if, for example, you have a footer that's optional, you don't have to place it there. Right? So I can put true here, and then come over to this guy, and in this guy say, hello, this is a footer. And if we run this thing, it should work all okay. See, you can't see it there because of the bad text, but it's there. And if I remove this, save, refresh, I should get a nice yellow screen of death, which is saying section not defined for footer. Okay? So this allows us to embed one section inside the other, and it's very useful for script references. So if I want to reference script files, CSS files, etc., that's kind of the way that you would do it. Okay. So let's just see a little bit more of Razor as we start to create a little bit more contents actually here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new controller. Okay, and I'm going to say it's an empty controller. Right, and now we're going to create a model. So I'll say, for example, var customer equals new customer. And this guy's going to have, for example, an ID and a name, right? And I can do view customer. And when we do an add view here, actually, I need to compile that so it picks up the, you need to compile so that it picks up the type it's being used. We can do create new view, create a strongly type. I'll say it's of type customer, and customer. And let's say, for example, it's a list. and this creates the template for me for a list. Now, the important thing to look at this is this guy over here. See the code now for Razor? It's much nicer than the syntax we have before with the whole ASPX. We don't have to do the less than, percent, etc., etc. There's a nice flow between the iteration and rendering out all the different elements in the display. Okay? See, I just do var item in model, display item name. There's no, opening. Before in ASPX, we would have to do the whole this business over here, which can get extremely, extremely annoying if you're doing this over and over again. So this makes it nicer, much simpler to kind of create code using Razor. Okay? So now that we've got this guy created, let's continue building on this thing. So I have this customer object over here, and we're going to start looking at some of the new things that have been added. Let me just go back to the PowerPoint. Validation. Now, how many of you have actually worked with validation in MVC3? Okay. Here's a question, actually, because it's really hard to see from back there. How many of you have actually worked with MVC3? Okay, cool. So I guess because nearly everyone put up their hand, so you were completely lost at my session yesterday, right? It's okay, you won't offend me. You can say yes or no. Yes? Good. See, there's one honest person. Okay? So, validation, it uses this concept of unobtrusive JavaScript now, which makes it much cleaner, and we'll see how that works. You have a whole bunch of new features in terms of data validation. You have the compare attribute, which we'll see, the remote, allow HTML, which will allow the form to send HTML data across. Remember that before in MVC2, if you wanted to send HTML, you had to restrict it at the model level to say, yes, I can send HTML, and this is not a cross-site scripting attack or any kind of attack on my website. Here you can limit it per type, per property of a model. String length minimum now works, and there was a lot of things that in MVC were actually there but didn't work. Now in MVC3 works. And for those of you that were at my session yesterday, you know that there's a new interface which is called iValidatable Object, which allows you to now create a validation across an entire object. Okay? I'm going to just show you some of the features in terms of data validation and data annotations that we have, which really, I mean, it's very simple, but the beauty of it is that it makes it much easier to work. It's, I mean, the constant battle between, and I'm not going to get into the dynamic static arguments here, but the Rails community has constantly been pushing around Rails is so much more productive than MVC and .NET. Yes, it is, but partially because, yes, it's dynamic, partially because of the gems, and also because they kick in a lot of conventions, right? Rails out of the box is active record. That's a data pattern. In MVC, there is no default. There is now, right? With MVC3, Tools Update 1, now you get a model. What is that model? That's Entity Framework. You get a lot of more conventions. Now we got NuGet. So now the productivity, the difference is starting to drop drastically. So don't go to Ruby just yet. Okay? Oh, sorry. What did I do? Okay, so that should actually go to models. Okay, so now I've got this models guy here, and I'm going to say, for instance, the name is required, and you've seen that, and we'll just create another property, which, for example, will be the email, and we're going to set this to required. Okay? We'll build this guy, and we'll go back to the customer controller, and we'll create a new action, which is action result, create, and this is going to launch the form for me, and we'll do return view customer, right? What's that? I don't need that. Okay, add view. So, strongly typed customer. There's a little bit of a bug here, right? And we'll say this is a create. I think that should be all. And you see that I get the nice, clean Razor syntax over here, and I get the validation message which exists, and we run this, and I can go to the customer site. This is what happens when you build on the same demo over and over again. And I can go to customer create, and I should get the form. And if I hit create, I get client-side validation built in, out of the box. Seeing the source code, you see that there is absolutely none of that ugly JavaScript that we had in MVC2. Nothing. It's using the data annotation, the data attributes from HTML5, which allow you to define your own kind of attributes, and JavaScript is picking those up and doing the validation based on that. Now, if you've done any client-side validation before, you know that in MVC2 it's got that horrible JavaScript that actually crashes browsers if you don't define things properly in certain scenarios. Here, we don't get that. And that is set at the web config level. So I can go to the web config here. That's the guy. And you see that I have client-side validation enabled out of the box. So no more enable client-side validation per view page. And the other guy, this unobtrusive JavaScript enabled, is what allows us to then get this nice clean output. Okay? So I'm going to do this because otherwise I'm going to keep switching back and forth. Where are we? To the there and there. Okay. So what else can we do here? Well, we've got the required. The next thing you can do is do a compare. So normally you have a lot of times you have property string password, and you have property string confirm password, right? This is constantly the same process of, oh, I'm putting in a password, and now I need to confirm it with another field. That's a new attribute that's been added, which is just compare. And we give it the name of the field that we want to compare to, so we say confirm password, we're done. Okay, let's go back to the view. I'm going to go to the view over here, get this guy, which is the email, duplicate that twice, and where are we? Over here, password. Password, 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 and this guy's going to be confirm, 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 and confirm. So we run this, and now we get client-side and server-side comparison of the two properties. Okay? Let me close the source code. Refresh this guy. So you see I can put ABC here, DEF, it doesn't match. Put ABC, and you get that. Beautifully on the client side, without having to write a single line of code. In this case, it's good to not to write a single line of code. Don't get me wrong, I'm not the rad kind of guy of drag and drop, and in next version we won't have to write a single line of code. Here it's great, because it's just infrastructure work that you don't need to repeat over and over again. Okay? The last thing in terms of validation, which I want to show you, is another thing. I can add a string username over here, right? And now there's a new attribute, which is remote, which allows me to make a remote AJAX call to do some validation on the server and then return a true or a false based on if it matches and display it on the client side with just an AJAX request. Okay? So the name of the action that I want to call, for example, check user, and the name of the controller, it's going to be, in this case, customer. Okay? And I'm going to go and create that method. And what you pass in here is a string username, which is the name of the property we want to check. So I can just do if username is different to me, then return JSON true. And you have to set the JSON request behavior to allow get, else return JSON false. I could have done this much more efficient, couldn't I? Allow get, okay? So what that's going to do is, no, that's not going to work, is it? Close away. Don't crash. Wow. So, I see the weather in Belgium is getting colder. Everyone says like, oh, the other day I went out the first night and it's like, you want another beer? I'm like, okay. You want another beer? I'm like, okay. Like, well, it's nice weather. We got to drink, right? But it is. It's really getting colder. I was walking home yesterday from the restaurant, and it was quite cold. Now, I'm from Spain. We envy you now, right? It's raining where I live. Right, where were we before? You know, they say a session isn't a session if Visual Studio doesn't crash at least once. But something's really messed up my computer because you cannot imagine how badly my fan is going here now. So here we're going to do username. Username. And let's run this. So customer, create. And you see that now I have username. And if I type Hadi, that's fine. If I type me, see it says username is invalid, right? So it's going back to the server with a client-side request, with a JavaScript request, an AJAX request, getting your validation, and done. Okay? Very simple. How many of you actually knew that? Oh. So could you admit that you've actually learned something new in this session? Good. Am I going too fast? Silence is a yes or no? Okay, good. Am I going too slow? Ooh. What's your name? Right. The model, the good, the dynamic, and the WTF. So, as I said in ASP.NET MVC, up to version 3, and this is about the best practices part, right? Up to ASP.NET MVC 3, we had no model. There is no concept of a model as such. In Rails, they had the active record. Are you familiar with active record, where we have an object which represents kind of a row in a database table? So if I have a customer, that corresponds to a customer row in the database table. Rails uses that. MVC, there was no criteria. With MVC 3, you now have the entity framework model built in. So you can now create the scaffolding, which I think Scott showed in some of the other talks. You create scaffolding, and that ties in directly to the entity framework. It also allows support for, if you use Steve Sanderson stuff, it also allows support for things like repository pattern, etc., so you can get information out of a repository. But there is now a kind of direction in MVC with models. So I ran a poll on Twitter some time ago, which was, do you use strongly typed views? Right? Because I was talking to a guy that does Rails development and also does MVC development. And of course, being a Rails guy, in .NET, he also uses the concept of active record, right? So I was saying, do you use strongly typed view? I ran this Twitter poll on Twitter, and it reached 90 votes, and I had to close it because I didn't have a paid account, and they only allow you 100 votes if you don't have a paid account. So, and 98% of the people said, yes, they do use strongly typed views. Now, what is a strongly typed view? It's a class that you can then access in the view with IntelliSense, and you get all the goodness of strongly typed data, and you can put annotations on to get, information for input and output, etc. The next question was, if you answered yes, do you bind directly to the domain model? So, in a sense, would that be the active record kind of approach? Out of which 22% said yes, 61% said they bind to the view model, and 17% say they bind to the view model with a reference of a domain model, right? So now we have the concept of a view model, and then the view model has in turn a reference of my domain object. Next question was, if you bind to a domain model, how do you handle partial updates? So for instance, one of the issues that kind of exists in Rails development is, if I have a customer and that customer has 10 fields and I only want to update 2 fields, what do I do? Right? How do you handle that situation? Well, you could do it in the controller, but it starts to get ugly. Right? You can put those exclude. How many of you know that there's a concept of an exclude attribute inside the action methods? Right? In the parameters that you pass in, you can put an attribute that says exclude, and you can list all the fields you want excluded. Do you know about it? If you don't, forget everything I said, because it's ugly. It's horrible. Don't use it. Right? So, how do you exclude things that you don't want updated? So some said, I use attributes, 25%. Others said they actually do some logic code in the controller. That's bad. We'll see why. 3 people asked for help. okay? And 13 other. Next question was, this is going to finish in about, there's only 15 more questions, okay, and then we're done. If you use view models, no, I'm joking. If you use view models, how do you handle mappings? So 49% said with AutoMapper, 36 manually. And then the guy that needed help was not happy, and others do other things that say there. How many of you know of AutoMapper? That's good. Okay. So, the last question. If you bind to the domain model, how do you deal with extra data such as country list? I stick it in the view bag or the view data. So from one side I have the view model, from another side I have view data where I can get like a combo of countries. I use HTML helpers, and you know there are people that are actually suffering. The point of this was that with MVC there is constantly a certain level of over and over again having to do the same things over and over and over and over and over again. Right? It's, oh, I got to get a list of countries. Oh, I got to get this. Oh, I've got to not bind to this value. Well, bind to that value. And I've been working with MVC since preview 1, and it starts to get tiring. Right? It starts to get tiring of having to do the same repetitive work over and over again. This was the validation, which was where do I place validation? Most people use the data attributes, etc. So let's just go over some of those things in terms of what is good, what is bad. Now, one of the things that has been introduced in ASP.NET MVC 4.3 is the concept of the dynamic views, in the sense that ViewBag now is a dynamic type. Have you worked with the dynamic type in C#? You know, it's like the 5th time that someone asks a question and they don't answer. The guy should know that he should stop asking questions, right? But I know, no, I'm going to insist, right? Have you guys worked with dynamic types in C#? Yeah, okay. So ViewBag is a dynamic type, okay? And what that allows me to pretty much define a class that doesn't exist from beforehand. What is a disadvantage? I don't have IntelliSense. What is another disadvantage? I don't have compile time checking. But what is the advantage? I don't have to have 350 classes in my project just to spit out data. Okay? So we've got the dynamic view, which is the ViewBag, but we can also create new dynamic classes, right? I can just, if I want to go to a list of customers, if I'm in my customer controller, I could just do this. Here's customers, right? Instead of creating customer type, I can say var customer equals new expando object, which is a dynamic base type, which you can more or less use. Customer first name equals Joe. Customer last name equals Smith, right? You see, that compiles, no problem whatsoever, right? And the problem is that you don't have the IntelliSense. You do, but that's free sharper. But it's only context, it's only scope. Outside of this scope, you don't have. I can now go to my index page, this guy, and I can say that this is no longer IEnumerable, not this guy, yeah, IEnumerable of customer, but it's of type dynamic, okay? Or IEnumerable of dynamic, right? What does that now give me? I now no longer have IntelliSense. I no longer have a strongly typed class that represents this. What is the advantage? That if tomorrow I want to add another value, if I want to add another field, I just write it out here. I don't have to create it in a class. I don't have 2 entry points. Remember what I was saying yesterday? If I want to add something, I don't want to have to remember to add it in 10 places. So I don't have to now modify my service layer that gives me back a new property, which I would have to do. Now I would have to also do the mapping, and I would have to create a new type, right? One advantage is if all I'm doing is listing data, why do I need a strongly typed class? What is the worst that could possibly happen if I run this application with a dynamic type and I've mistyped something? It doesn't show. Or I get a exception because that property isn't defined. Well, yes, but you normally, as I said, run your views before you deploy. So the bare minimum you will catch. Okay? And hell will not freeze over and a tsunami won't come and wipe us all out. Why? Because there is a lot of languages out there on the web that actually use dynamic stuff, and they're quite successful. You've heard of this thing called Facebook, for instance, right? So that's one option to consider. Like, why should I now use a strongly typed class? But some people want to, okay? And that's where the concept of view models come in. And I actually like view models, and I use view models, right? The problem is that they're also a pain. Because every time I want to, basically the way I work with ASP.NET MVC to date is that I let my view, that is the page, define my view model. So when I'm creating a customer, or when I'm getting data from a customer, for example, update the customer's password, I do not pass in a customer object to my view. I define a class which is just the fields that are required to do that operation, and that is defined by my user interface. So my user interface, my view, is defining my view model. Then I get that information, I map it over to some other object if necessary, but normally it would be just making a method call on some service or some domain object, passing in the parameters, right? That is the advantage of, you get a nice clean way of seeing what exactly that view does and where that data goes, and you don't have to worry about the exclude and the include and all those things, okay? Now the disadvantage of that is of course the mapping, which we'll see how to handle. The customer edit view model, here's another situation where a view model comes in handy, because if I want to list, for example, I say submit some customers, and I want you to submit also the country that that customer belongs to. You normally don't store, I say I want that view to have a combo box of countries you can select. You normally don't store that information in your database. If you're using an active record approach, you don't normally have the country of the customer and also a list of all the countries per record, right? You don't. So there wouldn't be a one-to-one direct mapping. That is when, again, the flexibility of this view model is good, because it allows me to define extra metadata that is used for submitting information. So it has its very good advantages. But where do we map? And here is where the single responsibility principle comes in. Oh, I'm not tired of saying this. I say this all the time, because it's core to anything you do, right? Anything you do, you have to apply the single responsibility principle. How many of you are actually married or have partners? Right. Especially the men. How many women in this audience? 1, 2. Right. This actually applies to men. So, have you ever tried to do something while your wife is talking to you? It doesn't work, does it? You're not listening to me, are you? Yes, I am. No, you're not. What was I just saying? Yeah, you see? In real life, you have to apply this thing as well. Now, apparently, women can actually do multiple things at the same time. We as men aren't capable of. Okay? So I won't get tired of saying single responsibility. And then you have the concept of the fat controller. This is where this whole thing comes in. This is the typical anti-pattern. I have a controller, and I do everything in there, right? So I have my controller, and what is the role of the controller in MVC? It's to what? Get data from the model, pass it to the view. Get data from the view, pass it to the model. It's not about making business decisions. It's not about making logical decisions around those business decisions. It's not about doing mapping, right? Because if it's doing mapping and it's doing an action that is getting data and sending data, what is it doing? More than one thing, right? And then what do I have in my controller code? I have action result. Map this object to this object every single time. And if I'm not using something like AutoMapper, it's even worse, because now I have manual mapping code, right? I got my view model, and then I got my active record, my domain object, and I have to map things over. Yeah? That is a mess, because our controllers start to grow. That's what the fat controller is about. Controllers should be thin. The rule of thumb I always apply is write your controllers so that when you want to unit test them, it would be meaningless, right? The value of unit testing a controller action would be meaningless. It would be of no value other than defining a business specification. So if you're doing behavior-driven development, or as I like to say, TDD done right, what you do is you define a business scenario. You say, when I go to the home controller, I want to display information about the user. That is very valid as a unit test because it's describing a functional specification that's compilable, that you can run, that you can validate. But beyond that, it shouldn't be testing logic or branches and things like that in your controllers, because if it is, your controller's too heavy. It's doing too much. And the problem with doing too much, again, boils down to not only, yes, we're breaking single responsibility principle, which, Uncle Bob is going to come and destroy us all, which he's not, but the reason behind that is, again, if I'm doing too much in my class, chances of having to touch that class when I want to change something are high. And when we touch code, we break it, especially if we don't have unit tests. Okay? And it also leads to not respecting the concept of dry. So, how do we leverage that? Now, some of this I showed you guys yesterday. If you're using, I'm going to show you a little bit with AutoMapper. If you're using filters, that is a good way to do AOP, aspect-oriented programming. What is aspect-oriented programming? Those are things that are cross-cutting to every class. So if every class has one responsibility, that is, I do one thing and one thing alone, certain things are done by multiple classes. For example, validation, authentication, logging. These are things that all classes more or less do, apart from that single thing they also do. Those are called cross-cutting concerns. That means they cut across all of the different classes. And one way to kind of solve that issue is with aspect-oriented programming, which says, let's just try and do something once and apply it to multiple classes. Okay? How do you do that in .NET? There are multiple ways. You can use, in terms of ASP.NET MVC, you can use attribute filters. If you're using an IOC container, you can use IOC interceptors, which is a great thing. Basically, that's using the concept of a proxy, and what it does is that before a method is called on your actual class, what it's going to do is an interceptor is going to perform some operation, which is great. It's a great way to do AOP. Okay? And in MVC, we have also global filters and the filter provider. So I'll show you how to do the auto mapping over here. Now, and I'll tell you what I'm working on, which will actually make it better. Well, I think it will. This is a real project that I'm working on, okay? So this is not demo code as such. So, normally what you see is, do I have actually a... Normally what you see is over here, let's look at, where is the mapping? Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong controller. Account controller. So this is some code that, forget that to do. This is some code that I want to show you, for instance. This is something that you normally see, okay? Wherever you're using AutoMapper, you see this line of code. Mapper.map account view update model to a specific user, for instance, right? Now, the problem with that is that you're constantly having to write that code over and over again. One way to leverage AutoMapper in ASP.NET MVC is to use the concept of filters, right? So now I have an automap filter which maps type of user to type of account update view model, okay? And I just put that as a filter on my action, and it will automatically do that. So although I'm returning a user here, what it's actually doing behind the scenes is taking that and mapping that user to an account view update model and then returning that as a result. How do you do that? Well, if you were in my session yesterday, you know that on the filters, the action filter attributes, and we have the on action executed. And what I'm doing here is I'm getting access to the model in my filter, and I am then taking and creating a view model by calling mapper.map, model, source type, destination type, and then sending the model back. Okay? The advantage of that is what? That I don't have that line of mapper.create. Big deal, you say. Yeah, but I have to have the attribute, right? So this is what I normally do with the attribute. The problem is that it's repeating over and over again. So what I'm doing now, unfortunately I won't show it to you because it's not ready, is another filter that is going to use convention. And what it's going to do is it's going to take a controller, and this is something you can do. It's not that hard to do. It will take a controller, take a method. So for instance, in our case, it would be account, method, update. And it will look in your project for a type called account update view model. If it finds it, it will then do a mapping. If it doesn't find it, it will just do nothing. So the advantage to that is that I no longer even have to put the auto map filter attribute on each of my actions. It will automatically use convention to do it. What is the disadvantage of that? Can someone tell me? Yep, that's it exactly. So the disadvantage is, like anything when we're using a lot of conventions, is that it starts to become a tiny little bit of hidden magic. It's like, why are you returning a user and I'm getting back a user model? And there's the balance of, should we educate the developer? Should we maybe write some unit tests? Should we maybe write a little README that specifies our conventions? Or should we treat everyone as an imbecile and do more explicit coding so that it's very, very apparent? Yes, it's a fine line, because we always say that Claude, or Martin Fowler said that, you know, every idiot can write code that a machine can understand, but it takes a genius to write code that humans can understand, right? So yes, it's always about writing clean code. That's one of the benefits of single responsibility principle. However, when it comes to a point where we're constantly doing the thing over and over again, there we start to value, maybe it does make sense to actually use in a convention and put in a little README that says, hey, this is how it works. Because it does save you and the developers and the team a lot of time. Okay? So that's one disadvantage. Another disadvantage, of course, is what happens if a specific scenario doesn't fit. But here's the thing. As developers, we tend to try and be too flexible. We think about 90%, you know, that 5% edge case, which never occurs. And we start to build in so much flexibility into our systems just in case that 5% occurs. And normally it never does. And if it does, well, we'll just handle it as a special case. It's no big deal, right? That is why, as again, Rails is so popular, because it's got one guy at the helm that is quite set in his ways and quite loud about it, and he says, these are the conventions. You don't like it? Tough. It works for us. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Leveraging REST. I want to go into this a little bit more, which I said initially yesterday in my talk. And I'll show you a little bit easy MVC. Now, how many of you were at Scott Hanselman's talk where he showed a NuGet package? All of you know what NuGet is, right? I mean, you have to know what NuGet is after this conference, right? Everyone? Okay. How many of you were at that talk where he showed the attribute routing? No one? Oh, okay. So the attribute routing, what it allows you to do is do attribute routing based on attributes on your controllers and actions. So you no longer have a centralized routing table, but you start to define your routes in your actions and controllers, right? Now, some people like that, some people don't like that. I personally don't like the fact that I have to decorate everything every time, okay? So, you know what REST is? You have to know what REST is as well, because you've been going to Glenn Block sessions, right? So, REST is about representational state transfer, and it's about focusing our applications on resources, on representation of those resources, and on letting the server, in a sense, define the workflow of our system. That's what the state transfer means. It means the client no longer maintains state, but the server, using hypermedia, which is one of the most forgotten about REST levels, is what's defining the workflow, right? Normally when you talk to people about REST, they're like, oh, that's easy. That's just put, delete, create, update. That's it, post. Those are the 4 verbs, and that's it. No, that's a cruddish, that's kind of like a API RPC kind of thing. REST is really about hypermedia. It's about, I create a customer, and when that customer, when the server responds to me, what it will then tell me is the ID of that customer via the location header in HTTP. It's about leveraging HTTP as an application protocol, not as a transport protocol. It's about when I make an order, I get back hypermedia links in my response, an A-link, just the way the web works. An A-link telling me what I have to do now. I have just placed an order. I can now go and collect it. I can now cancel it. And these things come back as hypermedia links, which then allows the server to define the workflow of how the application is running, which gives us great abilities to not be bound to a certain contract. We can change it on the fly, right? Now, I'm a big fan of, and Glenn and I always have these discussions, but I'm a big fan of using ASP.NET MVC as also a REST server, because it not only allows you to do these things, but it also gives you the ability to easily extend on that REST service and build a UI, right? Because ASP.NET MVC is for what? For web applications, right? That's what it's for. That's what Microsoft is telling us. It's for web applications. But it's also an application server. And with a little bit of tweaking, you can make it a REST server. With the added benefit that if you don't want the UI, don't write views. The day you want the UI, write the views. The day you want to talk to JSON, encode in JSON. And it's very capable of doing it very nicely. But you have to do some tweaking. Yesterday I showed you in a demo where you had the HTTP action verbs and you had to decorate each attribute, each action result with an attribute. HTTP put, HTTP post, HTTP get, etc. And then do some mapping in the routing, right? I'm going to show you something that's also available on NuGet, which uses routing-based conventions. Whether you want to do REST or not, you can use this. Let me open it. Okay, so basically what this is if we go to the MVC application, what I do is just create this guy. Okay, I do route generator, new route generator, generate routes from assembly. Okay, assembly, get executing assembly, and routes. In V2, you won't even have to write that line of code. So, route generator, what that does is basically take a look at your assembly, at your MVC application, and generate the routes for you. So if you look at my controllers here, for example, employee controller, you see that I have list, details, create, edit, delete. Okay? I have nothing else. I don't have any. See, I have 2 creates. There's no discriminator. There's no HTTP post here, right? If you don't have that and you run this application in a normal MVC application, what's going to happen? It's going to blow up. It's going to say, I don't know which method I have to execute, right? So there is no HTTP post, there's no HTTP get, none of that. However this works. The way it works is that what it's using is the default routing conventions. Where is it? Default route conventions, and what it does is basically follow a Fluent API to define your routes. Okay, so it says you can all see that, right? So it says map action index constraint to verb get, map action list to route plural. What that would do is that if I have a customer controller, it would then define it as customers, right? To constraint get. Now, map, let's go down to, for example, edit. map action edit with these parameters to custom URL edit, constraint to verb get, the delete, constraint to verb delete. So you see there's no to root URL. It's saying map delete to the root URL, that would be customer, and constraint it to the verb delete. What that allows me to do is, without me having to write any kind of attributes in my controllers or define any manual routes in my routing table, I get a completely REST service. Because it's, as long as I stick to those conventions, which if I don't like, I can change, right? As long as I define my controllers with an action called list, an action called delete, an action called details, I get the whole routing, okay? Without having to do anything else. In addition to that, also what you get is the content negotiation. So there's some other files here. Auto action result, right? This is an old version. And what this is doing, it's injecting, again, an action filter inside your MVC application, which what it will do is, based on the header that is being defined by the client, so if the client sends, so if the client does HTTP customers 25.json, it will automatically encode the view result. It will go to the view result, extract the model if it exists, and render that out as JSON. And it can work based on an extension or a URL. So you could write, for example, JSON, or the content type which browsers send, which from an application point of view is normally this is what you would send when you're talking to it from an application. From the browser, you normally don't do this because the browser doesn't let you really, without a plugin, to hook into the content type headers. Okay? So, what is the advantage to doing this? Well, it allows you to do a kind of, if you're looking for a RESTful kind of architecture, whether you use this library or whether you do this manually, MVC is a great platform for it. It's a very good platform for it. There's also WCF REST API, yes. But as I said, the advantage to this is that you get the user interface for free. You don't have to hook this up to a certain view engine. Okay? But again, it's like everything. You can use NHibernate, you can use Entity Framework. You can use Link to SQL. Well, you couldn't, but you get the picture, right? You did. Coping with complex applications. Any questions up to now? No? Okay. Dependency injection, you're familiar with that, right? Yes, already everyone knows it. We've been beating it to death with dependency injection. Okay, but that is the key. Coping with large applications is via dependency injection. Startups. We talked about Web Activator. Okay? Web Activator is great when you're doing the modular things. Again, take NuGet, set up a NuGet server on your own machine with your own packages. Forget NuGet.org. Forget it. It doesn't exist. That's great for open source libraries. But now start to leverage NuGet yourselves. Set up a NuGet repository, create your packages, push them to that repository, a local repository for your company, and start to build applications as modular pieces. Web Activator allows you to do that easily because everything you do with MVC you have to plug in to some extensibility point, and that's normally defined in the MVC application start. You don't need to do that anymore. You can use Web Activator. Okay? And the iStartup is pretty much the same as Web Activator, and you can use this concept in pretty much anything you do with an IOC container and dependency injection. You see, a lot of people, when you talk to them about dependency injection, they're like, oh, I don't need that. Why not? Because I don't do unit tests. Right. I don't need that. Why not? Because I only ever have one implementation of iCustomer repository, and it's never going to change in my life, and I'm never going to have a second implementation of iCustomer repository. Great. But look beyond that. Look beyond an IOC container as merely injecting dependencies in your code. It does much more than that, right? Here's an example that I, again, use in a kind of a real-world application. And you can use this for different things. So this is, let's go to my MVC start. This is my MVC start. You see? There's no code there to register routing tables. There's no code there to register areas. There's no code there to set up a database. There's absolutely nothing. All there is my container, which I'm using structure map, which you can use whatever you want. And what I do is I call the container and I say get all instances of this concept called the iStartup task. And that iStartup task is an interface that defines a method called execute. Okay? And then in my solution folder, I have a folder startup task and I have automapper setup. Right? So everything that requires a startup, all I do is add a new class. So I have automata setup, I have create database setup, I have init MVC routes. So this is all to do with routing. Then I have wire up MVC, all to do with wiring up the different extensibility points of MVC. And I have this for what? I have it for startups, right? What that allows me to do is that tomorrow, if I add something new, all I got to do is add a new class that implements that interface. And that does what? That allows you to comply with another principle, which is called the open-close principle. Adapting to change without having to touch code, without changing the class, right? But this is used beyond startup. I have this project in turn, for example, does decoding. You give it an XML file, and it decodes it, and it tells you what type of XML file it is, right? I have 4 types that I recognize right now. Tomorrow, if I want to add a 5th type, what do? I just implement an I decoder. And my container is just going to put it out, see if it matches. If it does, I have it. I don't have to do any ifs. You know, there's a campaign that goes around about anti-ifs. It's a little bit extreme. But this is the idea. Every time I add a new condition, I don't have to go and change code. I just add code. Right? I don't have to go back and maintain that code later. Well, I do, but not touch the code that I already have. Okay? So this concept I've just shown you, the idea behind dependency injection is not only I want to test my code. It's not only if something ever changes in my life. Go beyond it. Think of an IOC container as much more. Think of it as a system that allows you to do discoverabilities, right? And MEF, everyone understands MEF. Why? Because they said, oh, you can drop a DLL into a folder, and we pick it up. This is exactly the same thing. The difference is that instead of a DLL, I'm writing a class. But if you want a DLL, you can do that too, right? Structure map has load assemblies from file and discover the types from the file. It's exactly the same thing. Move beyond this concept of DI is only for advanced programs. It is core to creating robust and scalable. And scalable, I mean maintainable as well, not just high performance, okay? When do you use iStartup task? When do you use Web Activator? Relegate Web Activator to packages so that it doesn't mess up your MVC application. That is using the same concept that I just showed you as an iStartup task, but it's separating it out. So it's an ideal scenario for packages. For everything else inside your application, you can do the kind of iStartup task that I've shown you here. Amazon.com. You all know Amazon.com. That's a very large site, right? And recently, EC2 went down. And it hit us hard. So it wasn't only the social networks that went down. It hit some of our servers as well at JetBrains. But anyway. So, Amazon.com. That's their homepage. That's quite complicated. You have your books on the left. Right? You have your books on the left, you have your Amazon gift cards at the lower bottom, you have the big savings in the middle, what other people are buying, your shopping cart at the top, and you have the whole search aspect there as well. If that was my home controller, and we're talking about fat controllers and thin controllers, and we're talking about controllers should only do one thing. Remember, yesterday I was even saying we should go beyond the concept of controller and just have classes, individual classes that execute actions. Because otherwise we end up with a controller that does 100 things. That would be crazy to put all of that what you see up there in a home controller. You shouldn't ever do that, right? Never. For that, you should use another thing that exists in ASP.NET MVC, which actually existed from MVC 1. It was in an add-on package that you could download from Codeplex, which was called Render Action. And I think it was at MVC 3 that they actually put it in the code itself. And what Render Action does is from the view, it calls out to an action, which allows you to then call a controller an action, render information, and bring it back. So in this case, what I would have is a home controller, and my search bar at the top that you see there would be a search controller. And it would have an index that would render the search. The shop all departments would be a shop controller. Greatest gifts controller. Now being browsed controller. And all of these do their all individual thing, and your home controller, all it does is pull back this information. And whoever says to you, oh, but that goes against the principle of ASP.NET MVC and the model and this has to call that, and normally it's just like, you know, yeah, whatever. So does Ajax. Anyway, so this guy, I actually have this one done, and I named it conveniently. Where are we? So this is an example of a code that I did with MVC 1, and it still compiles with MVC 3. And it runs with no changes whatsoever. So let's run it. Of course, now it'll fail. That did fail miserably. Did I open the wrong demo? Oh, I opened the wrong demo. Oh, no, never mind. You can see it here. I have, yeah, there you go. Render action. So what that's going to do is call out to, in this case, it's going to call out the action method to the contents controller, right? So this is a contents controller, and this guy is going to render a partial view and send back information. The question sometimes people ask is, when should I do this as just a partial view? So I create a kind of equivalent of a user control, and when should I call out to render action? So the difference is that user controls in ASP.NET MVC don't have the concept of behavior. They just repeat elements that you want to render all the time, HTML. Right? There's no concept equivalent to the ASP.NET Web Forms, which is I have a control which is at the same time a behavior. Right? So when I do have behavior, when I do have some data that needs to change, whatever, that is when I can do the render action. If it's just rendering out a section of HTML, you can just use a partial view for that. There's no need to really do this. Okay? So that's about it in summary. I got the timing more or less right. I've left you guys with 6 minutes. It's, as I said, it's kind of what I've shown you here is my kind of experience with MVC and what I've gained over the years to see what works, what doesn't work. One thing I would say, and I said this yesterday, especially now, you need to really start looking at NuGet and leveraging it. It's not as hard as you think to set up, and it's beautiful. And once you get it, I mean, all the libraries that I've actually written, I set up as NuGet packages. And I don't know if Scott showed, I'm sure he showed in his session how to actually create NuGet packages. It's very, very simple, right? So leverage NuGet, plug into the extensibility points of MVC, and above all, apply convention as much as you can. The more conventions you apply, the easier your life will be, because those edge cases are not so important, and they can be solved in a different way. So don't be afraid that doing a convention is going to not work for me. However, one good piece of advice is never create a convention after the first application. Only when you do 2, 3, 4 applications, then create a convention. Because a convention is kind of like creating some packages, creating a framework, and you never in your life start writing a framework. You extract it from sample applications, okay? Because otherwise it just doesn't work. That's called the ivory tower frameworks, okay? So You can scan that. You can get my contact details. My email is hadi@jetbrains.com. Blog is Hadi Hariri, and my Twitter is hhariri. If you have any questions, you can stop me afterwards. If not, please feel free to email me. I hope that there wasn't much overlap with the previous session. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.